Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fiscal Focus at DawnNews English. I'm your host, Danish Khan, and today we are going to talk about social transformation in Pakistan and its impact on Pakistan's political economy and politics. In particular, we'll explore the role of middle classes in terms of prospects of strengthening democracy. Today's discussion will help us understand one of the most pressing issues of Pakistan's political economy, and that is the unhappy marriage between establishment and the mainstream political party. To discuss these issues, I'm joined by Professor Umair Javed. Umair is Assistant Professor of Sociology at LUMS, and he has published multiple research studies on Pakistan's political economy and informal economy. His current research focuses on processes of transformation. Umair did his PhD from London School of Economics, and he's a prolific author. He writes a fortnightly column for Dawn. So now I want to get into our topic, and I mentioned we're going to discuss social transformation. So I want to start with a very basic question, and that is, can you specify what are some key characteristics of the ongoing social transformation, especially in the past decade or so?
Sure. So when we, as social scientists, I think when we talk about social transformation, we're generally referring to two or three sort of main aspects, right? The first is demography, which is where do people sort of generally reside in a particular society? What type of work are they engaged in? And what type of family structures and obviously household structures are they a part of? The second is sort of related more closely to the economy. So what shape does production take place in a particular economy? What are the sort of patterns of consumption? How is wealth distributed? What are the sources of wealth and income in a particular society? And I think the third aspect that we look at, it has more to do with the source of ideas and the content of ideas that may prevail in a particular society, right? So what do people think about, say, politics? What do people think about religion? What do people think about gender attitudes, right? And so on. So I feel like all of these things collectively are what we would classify as basic aspects of any society, and tracking change in them is what would allow us to answer the question of what does social transformation actually look like. So in the case of Pakistan, I think it's some of the main sort of headline aspects of social transformation. And because you mentioned the last decade, so we look at data from the last decade, I think one of the big one is obviously urbanization, that Pakistan, is the most rapidly urbanizing country in the region. It also has the highest share of the urban population in South Asia. So officially, statistics say that it's about 38%, about 39% based on the last census. But we know for a fact that this is underestimated considerably. In fact, there was a 2016 study which looked at geospatial data and economic activity, as well as population density and infrastructure, and concluded that up to about 70% of Pakistan's population actually lived in peri-urban or urban areas, right? So and this was back in 2016, 2017. So we're, 7 years on from that number could have only gone up. So urbanization is obviously that big thing that's happened, that there are fewer people living in rural areas and far more sort of living in denser agglomerations of the population. But really, when we talk about urbanization, we're also talking about a much deeper structural phenomenon, which is the nature of the economy. And so in Pakistan, if you look at the last decade, one sort of figure that's been sort of, changing at a fairly rapid clip, over these last 10, 15 years is the percentage of employment in agriculture. So how many people are directly working on farms? How many of them are directly affiliated with the farm economy? And so in 2010, 2011, that figure was about 45% of the labor force. So that number, 4 years ago, or 2020, 2021, which is when, the last round of the labor force survey was carried out, that number had gone down to about 37%, right? And so that additional sort of, 8% has moved into other more quote-unquote urban sectors of the economy. So what are those urban sectors? Construction, wholesale and retail trade, transportation and storage, and a small portion of that has also gone into manufacturing, right? So what we see is this kind of sort of economic transformation take place where fewer people are dependent on agriculture, which has historically been sort of the main source of employment in the country. And finally, we're at a stage where that number is increasingly sort of tilted towards urban occupations. And then very closely associated with that is also the structure of employment in the country, right? So as far as sort of the last 10, 15 years are concerned, what we see is that the number of people who are engaged in waged employment, which is that they command a wage for a certain type of sort of work that they do, that number has gone up by about 6%. So we're almost at the 50% mark. There's still a very large portion of the population that is self-employed. So that number has remained mostly sort of static over the last 10 years. It's about 35%. But the big drop that we see happening is in contributing family workers, which is essentially household labor that was previously being employed to work on the farm or to work in small-scale businesses. And I think that number is going down, and there are increasingly more people opting out for waged employment rather than working on family, businesses. And I think this actually tells us that. Yeah, sorry.
Clarifying question, so when you mentioned that 50% of the labor force is engaged in wage labor, is that a high number or a low number? It seems very low.
It's still very. No, it's still quite low. But if you look at what the sort of, I guess if the comparison has to be made both with sort of with obviously comparative countries, so that would include places like India, for example, or Bangladesh. And the number is roughly similar across these three countries. But it also, if you do a comparison with where Pakistan was 2 decades ago, this number wasn't particularly high. In fact, it was in the high 30s, in the late 1990s. So we're sort of, inching up towards 50%. It'll probably reach, if the sort of economic trajectory, is reasonably standard, we think that it'll sort of go up to about 65, 70% over the next decade or so, or maybe decade and a half. But what's also important to note is that a lot of this is happening in small scale businesses, largely in the informal economy, right? So even the kind of waged employment that we see, we can talk about informality in more detail in a bit, but it's largely happening in a very diffused, disaggregated, small scale sort of manner. It's not the sort of classic type of waged employment that we associate with mid-20th century capitalism, where people were working in large factories or in large businesses, right? So I think that's the other thing. And finally, the third thing, which is associated with that third factor of sort of culture and ideas, we see that connectivity has just sort of, that the infrastructure of connectivity and the landscape of connectivity in Pakistan has just completely transformed over the last decade, right? So about 95% of all households now in Pakistan rely on cell phones for their basic sources of information. Just over 60% have access to cable television. And these numbers are sort of continuously rising, right? So, a decade ago, it wasn't even sort of imaginable for us to conceive of such high levels of penetration as far as information access and connectivity was concerned. But these are the two big ones that really seem to have had a pretty lasting impact on a number of other things as well.
Why are these important, and what are its implications on politics of Pakistan?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think our basic sort of idea is that politics is not something that just happens because of people's, it doesn't happen in isolation from other larger things that are happening in a society, right? And as social scientists, we know for a fact that there are structural compulsions and forces that really shape and condition people's viewpoints on politics. It shapes their political attitude, it shapes who they support, it shapes the kind of policies that they want in power. And that's really a core tenet of how societies generally function, right? Obviously, we can have sort of, more rudimentary ideas of how that works. So we could sort of just argue that the kind of work that you do is going to sort of, it's going to determine the kind of politics that you have. But we know that it's slightly more multifaceted than that. It's not just the kind of work that you do, but also the kind of places that you socialize in. It's also where you live. So geography really matters. It's also what your cultural identity is. That also tends to matter. So a lot of these things tend to work together, right? And so our sort of, our argument here would be that you have all of these changes taking place, urbanization, which means more denser populations, greater agglomeration. You have sort of, greater sort of lack of sort of reduction in reliance on agriculture as a source of living, greater sort of involvement in the informal economy and sort of small scale businesses. And then thirdly, you have this rapid connectivity, which is using digital and sort of media infrastructure, right? And we think that collectively, these sort of transformations have an impact on how people see the world, and especially the political world. It has an impact on the kind of messages that they both imbibe and the kind of messages that they end up shaping through their participation in digital ecosystems. And I think ultimately that has an impact on the kind of politics that we see.
Right. So where does middle class fit in all of this? Because there's a lot of talk about the rise of middle class and its engagement in Pakistan's political landscape. And you mentioned urbanization multiple times. And again, I am also interested in studying urbanization and urban development. Can you specify qualitative difference between folks living in urban spaces vis-a-vis rural spaces in terms of their political aspect?
So I'll start with the first one, which is this idea of the middle class, right? I mean, middle classes are, at least the idea of a middle class is very closely or intimately tied with the development of modern social science and specifically modern sociology, which was that, as economies sort of become more advanced, in particular as capitalism develops, you have sort of the creation of a particular managerial class in a given society, which is largely responsible for managing the affairs of the state, but also affairs of capital, right? And so Pakistan has always had a middle class. It's this idea that somehow the middle class is a new thing is a misnomer. Pakistan has had a state level middle class in sort of its entire existence. We're talking about officers and officials who've been associated with the state and with state employment since forever. But one thing that has changed over the last 2 or 3 decades is an expansion of a particular demographic, which is associated with educational attainment and work that comes out of that educational attainment, right? So we're talking about people who have, a graduate degree, an undergraduate or a graduate degree, people who work as usually what we call quote unquote white collar employees, are salaried either in the state or in the private sector. That's really the section of society that we're talking about. It's very hard to pin down numbers when we're talking about the middle class in Pakistan because we don't have access to good data. But generally, you can come up with a picture of what the middle class looks like through a combination of looking at educational attainment, consumption patterns and income, and you'll get a sense of it. But what's also important to note here is that the real sort of big shift that we see happening is in educational attainment, right? So if you look at the cohort of individuals in Pakistan who are between the ages of 25 to 35, right? These are sort of your young, mostly just people who just started out in the labor force and people who've been around for a few years. Nearly 1 in 5 of them have a BA degree or above, right? So 1 in 5 is a graduate, a college graduate, or has a higher credential, beyond just a simple undergraduate degree, right? One generation ago, so if you take the cohort that is about 35 years older than them, this number was 1 in 10, right? So in the space of a generation, college attainment has almost doubled. And these are estimates based on data from 2017. This number would have only gone up in the interim period, in the last 6-7 years that we've seen this. So if we talk about an expanding middle class, one thing that we can use to understand this is college attainment. But closely associated with that is that the idea of becoming middle class, this idea that if you obtain a college degree, you'll be able to sort of access stable employment, that you'll be able to access consumption, that you'll be able to sort of, become part of a more upwardly mobile segment. That idea has become pervasive throughout the country. It's something that we find, being, and Asam Sajadakhtar, my sort of ex-professor, has sort of written about this extensively, is that there's a middle class that might exist there, but then there's also an aspiring middle class, people who want to aspire to become part of the middle class. And education is one source of sort of, opening up that it's one source of that aspiration. Whether that aspiration is actually realized or not is something completely separate. So I'll come to the second thing that you asked, which is how does urban and rural actually differ? And I think sometimes the differences are overstated. It's not like people in rural areas do not have access to information anymore. I think they're consuming pretty much the same kind of content, and they're part of this a shared digital ecosystem that we see in Pakistan. And I think that was reflected partly in the results of the 2024 election that was held in February. But there are other sort of differences between people who, so communities in rural areas tend to sort of operate around biradari-based linkages or kinship-based networks. They tend to operate around the structure of the village as a social space. There are deep-seated inequities of caste, and class, especially based on land ownership patterns that continue to have some sort of a weightage in terms of how politics takes place in a rural area and so on. In urban areas, there is obviously inequity still exists. Class-based inequities are obviously, fairly more common. But in Pakistan, what we see is that you find new forms of association in urban areas. That could be sort of, associations at the neighborhood level. It could be co-ethnic sort of association, as we've seen in the case of Karachi, but also in Quetta and Rawalpindi. And so I think that becomes the model of doing politics. So that becomes the model of social and political participation in an urban area. And I think that's where you could see some distinction between the urban and the rural.
Makes sense, and especially the provision of public goods seems very much relevant or the defining topic in rural areas. Because I come from a very rural space in Kashmir, where, public goods is everything. The politics revolves around public goods. Now, in terms of prospects of strengthening democracy, historically, especially among progressive and left-leaning scholars, have argued that middle class might be reactionary force, right, in the larger scheme of things. But how do you conceptualize the role of middle class in terms of strengthening democracy in the country?
Yeah, again, that's a great one, and it's complicated to answer because I feel like the middle class has had different types of it's hard to sort of to ascribe sort of a homogeneous political impact on the entire class as a whole, right? So we do like what is second best mechanism, which is we look at the parties and the associations that the middle class supports, and we sort of use that as a proxy to assess, okay, this is what the middle class's political leanings actually look like. And there, obviously, the results are fairly mixed, right? So in the late 1960s, for example, both the conservative middle class, which was the middle class that was which was closely aligned with religious politics or religious political forces, as well as the secular and progressive middle class, they both tended to support democracy against the Ayub Khan dictatorship. Right, the students were mobilizing. We had the Jamaat Islami as an oppositional force. You had the rise of the People's Party around that time, and obviously you had East Pakistan. In East Pakistan, you had obviously the Bengali language movement and the student movement that was very clearly against the authoritarian infrastructure and the authoritarian state at that time, right? So you have that, but then at the same time, at various points in the past, so such as in the late 70s, we saw the middle class sort of collude with conservative political forces and with the military in the aftermath of the 1977 military coup. But then in 2006-7, with the lawyers' movement, you could say that they sort of emerged as a force that sort of was attempting to democratize politics and sort of engaged in civic participation in some form. But really, it's the period between 2008, since the restoration of formal democracy in Pakistan, and up till maybe 2022, where the role of the middle class becomes slightly unclear as far as democracy is concerned. That sure, it was largely supporting one particular political actor, but that political actor was unwilling to play by the sort of the rules that were set out in the constitutional and political system at that particular point in time.
It seems like there's a cycle, one mainstream party gets alienated and they become a symbol of pro-democracy movement, and the other one just joins hands with establishment. How do you see the role of middle class in terms of making sure that there is some sort of consistency among mainstream parties, so they hold accountable their parties for their political and principle?
I think in Pakistan, it's really hard to have a conversation on sort of the social drivers of democratization, or what would or social forces that could enable democratization, given sort of how the structure of the state is it actually functions, right? And I think if you look at sort of the role of the establishment and the oversized impact that it has on the state itself, it really doesn't leave much space for other political actors to actually set up something on their own, right? So they're all sort of interacting with the military establishment, and that ends up shaping what their politics as well. And I think the middle class has been a part of that same type of politics, where everything sort of is based around the establishment. You're either in opposition, as you said, you're either in opposition to it, or you're partnering with it in order to secure something. But I think there's a deeper problem at play here, which is a problem and a crisis. And I think you've written about this, and sort of many others have also talked about this, is that there's a crisis of the economic base in Pakistan, right? There's a crisis of the economy that has become apparent in the last 10 or so years, but essentially we've been on a divergent path, compared to other lower middle income countries since the 1990s. And it's quite clear that the economy is not dynamic enough to sustain a stable political sort of formation, right? And what I mean by that is that if the economy produces a certain amount of sort of surplus, right? If it produces a certain amount of sort of profit, a certain amount of capital that's accumulated every single year, that capital can be distributed in a certain way which, satisfies the requirements of, elite groups, it satisfies the requirements of middle class groups, and some of it sort of, trickles down to the working class as well. The problem with Pakistan is that the pie is, to use that sort of, it's being done to death, but to use that analogy, the pie is sort of, isn't growing rapidly at all. In fact, it's fairly stagnant. But the claimants to that pie, the number of claimants seems to have increased quite a lot.
Now, building on this, we talked about the role of establishment, and we have seen multiple ways. Can you think of a way or thought experiment that the establishing democracy in Pakistan becomes a win-win for all key stakeholders here, especially establishment and the mainstream political parties, or it will always remain a zero-sum game?
Yeah, I'm going to sort of err on the side of pessimism here. I don't think it's possible, especially in a stagnant or undynamic economy, to create a win-win situation across a bunch of reasonably powerful political actors and then one oversized sort of outsized political actor, right? If the economic and material interests of the officer class of the establishment, and I'm talking about both the military establishment, also the permanent bureaucracy, if somehow you can guarantee and protect them, right? And you say, this is what you need, whatever X percentage of the pie every year, this is what we can, so that means pensions, that means, toys for the boys, that means all of those sort of other things, all the goodies and the perks and privileges. And there is still enough left over, that can then be distributed to all the key constituencies for all the major political parties, right? So that means we're talking about the petty bourgeoisie in Punjab, we're talking about the urban middle classes, we're talking about co-ethnic sort of voters in Sindh, we're talking about sort of elites in Balochistan and so on. Then we might actually see a more stable political settlement emerge, right? Where the interests of the most dominant actor have been satisfied, but then there's enough left over for all the parties to actually, meet the requirements of their own constituents.
To conclude our discussion, can you think about what are some future trends that you anticipate in the realm of social transformation and its potential impact on political economy of Pakistan?
Sure. So I think in the social domain, one thing I see emerging as a trend that really I think is going to be a powerful one over the next couple of decades is going to be sort of transformations in gender relations in the country. And the reason I say this is because women right now are at par, if not slightly ahead, when it comes to higher education attainment, amongst people below the age of 35 in Pakistan, right? So more women are getting educated than men. That is surely going to have an impact on women's attitudes towards work in terms of attitudes towards household labor, attitudes towards labor force participation, all of these things, right? We haven't seen a substantial impact so far, but anecdotally, I think that's going to change. And as we all know, historically, whenever societies undergo some form of a gender-based sort of transformation, that is usually accompanied with violence, right? Because as male power sort of recedes, as men have to fight for opportunities in the labor market with women who may be more qualified and are more educated, that may give rise to a politics of masculinity, of honor, and all of that. I think we see the seeds of that actually emerging in the kind of politics that the Tehreek-e-Labbaik, for example, practices as well. So this is like it's one area. It's an exciting part of transformation that may happen, with the gender revolution in Pakistan. At the same time, there are sources of conflict that it might also sort of engender at the same time. Politically, I see sort of, and I don't want to predict what's going to happen in Pakistani politics. I think that's a futile endeavor. But if you were to look at what has happened historically, I think a negotiated settlement between the middle class and the establishment is the most likely outcome. And when I say between the middle class and the establishment, I mean the leadership of the middle class, which at this current point is the PTI, and the establishment and that negotiation is going to allow this new sort of, this upsurge and this assertion a seat at the table, but in a curtailed manner. So it will not be the revolution that many sort of are aspiring for or hoping for, but rather it will be an accommodation that, leads to a cooling off period of some sort. So if one has to look for a historical analogy, I find the 1988 return of Benazir as to be a particularly instructive one, right? The People's Party had demonstrated that it was still the most popular party despite a decade of repression. And when the elections happened, it won those elections. It would have won an even bigger majority had there not been rigging. And so they were allowed to come back into power, although again, with all sorts of curtailment, in place. So I think that is one possible future, that this assertive middle class politics that we see, a politics of self-actualization, a politics of that's based on anti-corruption populism, that's based on sort of, at this point, pro-PTI sentiment. I think that may be allowed a space back into the system, but after having sort of, reached some form of a negotiated, again, settlement.
Thank you so much for your time, Umair. It was wonderful talking to you. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Until next time, this is Danish Khan signing off from Fiscal Focus at Dawn News English.